The geological story of Rokua Geopark begins from the gneisses in Lake Olu region. The gneiss rocks belong to the oldest bedrock area of the European Union. They have crystallized deep under an ancient mountain range almost 3 billion years ago. The mountains formed in a collision of Earth's early continents. At that time, the Earth's atmosphere was lacking oxygen, and there were no conditions for life on land surface. There were primitive forms of life living in oceans, and cyanobacteria were the most developed form of life. The ancient continent started to split at about 2100 million years ago. Molten rock erupted from the cracks which opened in the Earth crust. Part of the magma crystallized in the cracks to diabase. Gradually, the cracks opened to become valleys and sea bays in which sand and gravel were deposited. Over time, erosion exposed the diabase veins on surface. They can be recognized as dark-colored veins and gneiss outcrops in Manamonsalo. The sand and gravel deposits crystallized to quartzites and conglomerates, which can be most easily found in rocky grounds in Utajärvi. The ocean was closed due to a collision of tectonic plates. As a result, a mountain range was formed. Climate was tropical because the mountain range was located in tropical zone. However, life still existed only in oceans. Deep under the mountains, some of the marine sediments crystallized to schists and gneisses, or melted and recrystallized into granites. Most of the bedrock in Rokua and in the valley of River Olu is composed of these rocks nowadays. You can find schists and granites in boulders around Rokwanvara, or reddish granites in cliffs of River Olu along Lemonpolku Nature Trail. In the Muhos region, a block of bedrock started to sink and became a shallow bay. At first, gravel, sand, and silt were deposited in the deltas of ancient rivers, discharging into the depression. As the sea deepened, clay was also deposited on its bottom. The deposits crystallized to sediment rocks of Muhos Formation. You can see an outcrop of gravel stone in a cliff by River Olu, close to Manta. Sediment rocks of Muhos Formation contain fossils of primitive unicellular organisms. In places, the sediments are reddish, because the continent was located in tropical zone during the sedimentation and chemical weathering was efficient. During the last million years, Rokua Geopark has been repeatedly covered by continental ice sheets. The latest ice sheet reached the largest extent about 18,000 years ago. At that time, the ice sheet was 2.6 kilometers thick in Rokua Geopark area and expanded as far as the northern parts of Germany and Poland. As climate warmed up, the ice sheet started to melt. The slowly moving ice sheet eroded the underlying rock, forming rounded outcrops called roches mountainese and their striations. The rock material detached from bedrock were deposited on the bottom and at the edge of the ice sheet into moraine landforms. The ice sheet also transported huge rocks called erratic boulders. The erratic boulder in Vala is about the size of a small detached house and weighs several 100,000 kilos. Rokua Esker traverses the entire Rokua Geopark area. The esker consists of gravel and sand deposited by glacial meltwater. Gravel was deposited in ice tunnels where meltwater ran. At the edge of the ice sheet, meltwater burst out and deposited sand into a delta. On Rokwanvara, the esker and delta deposits are 100 meters thick in places. The fine-grained sand of the deposits originates to the sediment rocks of Muhos Formation. In front of the ice sheet existed Lake Ankylos, where fishes and seals of the Arctic fresh waters were living. There was no vegetation on the edge of the ice sheet because at Rokua the sands were deposited below the surface of Lake Ankylos. Human settlement had already spread to the tops of the River Olu watershed in Suomussalmi, where the land areas had been released under the ice sheet. Rokua Geopark released under the continental ice sheet 10,700 to 10,500 years ago. A couple of centuries later, the highest hilltops emerged from the early Baltic Sea, the Lake Ankylos. As the esker was deposited, ice blocks were buried in the sand. As they melted due to climate warming, kettle holes were formed. The highest esker mound of Rokwanvara, the Bukavara Hill, is bordered by several kettle holes. One of them, Well of the Depths, is the deepest natural kettle hole in Finland. As the kettle holes still were forming, strong westerly winds eroded bare sand. and accumulated it into dunes. Lake Olu was cut off from Lake Angeles 9,500 years ago. About 2,000 years later, the water level was still several meters higher than today. Instead of Kaivanansalmi Strait, Manamansalo was connected to the mainland by a land strip. The earliest known traces of settlement around Lake Olu date back to these times. Beside of Manamansalo, there were dwelling sites in Kankari, Jalanka, and around Lake Nimis, for example. Lots of ceramics, stone artifacts, and remnants of dwelling sites have been found in these locations. Fishing and waterways were important reasons to settle waterfronts. In addition, hunting game like deer and picking berries were important livelihoods. Vegetation was very lush because of mild climate. The average temperature was over 2 degrees higher than today. The Stone Age inhabitants followed the moving river mouth. At about 5,600 years ago, the river mouth and shoreline were located in Lepanimi and Muhos. In Lepanimi, an abundant Stone Age settlement was developed on both sides of the River Olu because the river mouth remained in Puhakoski Rapids for a long time. The river mouth was a favorable place to live. There were good deer hunting and berry picking lands nearby. Fish and seals were sought from the river and the sea. The watersheds were also important itineraries used for connections to the east to Vienna Karelia and to the west to the Scandinavian countries. Vegetation was still lush because of the mild climate, and noble hardwoods were common. However, climate was already turning colder. The River Olu has been an important itinerary and trade route since the Stone Age. From the Stone Age to the Middle Ages, a dynamic hunting culture was practiced in the River Olu Valley and Lake Olu areas. A permanent settlement became more common in the 16th century. The main livelihoods were agriculture, rapid shooting, fishing, and tar production. The rapids of the river attracted tourists from abroad, and the heads of state also went to try rafting. Wealthy salmon lords, especially from England, came to the river to catch salmons. The Lepinemi Hanging Bridge and Tourist Lodge opened up views of the free-flowing Puhakoski, where salmon dams and skillfully shooting boats were visible. The wild foams of the river have plagued many folk tales with their giants. The construction of the River Olu was prepared even before the Second World War. In the peace treaty of the Continuation War, Finland lost a third of its hydropower. At the same time, the need for electricity increased, which accelerated the construction of the River Olu. The construction of the power plants and their residential areas was a huge work. For example, in the construction site of Puhakoski, the biggest of the power plants, there were 1,700 employees at the same time. By the end of the 1950s, power plants were completed in 5 additional locations, for example in Manta. The power plants and residential areas designed by architect Arne Irvi are now nationally valuable cultural history sites.